Ahoy, and welcome to Titanic Talkline. I am Alexia, and I'm clearly in a good mood. Do I have anything new to announce? Oh, I am beginning to look for season 2 guests. So if you would like to be a guest on the show, or if you would like to nominate someone against their will to be on my show, send me an email at titanictalkline@gmail.com, or you can send me a message on any of the social media platforms: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Titanic Talkline, and get in touch. And I'll see what we can set up. Just in case you're wondering for scheduling purposes when that's going to be, I know it's far in advance, but it's probably closer to the beginning of next year. But I am a super advanced planner, and that's necessary for me. So yeah, let me know if you want to be on the show, or if you want to force someone to be on the show. And in the meantime, please enjoy today's interview. Well, I would like to thank you again for giving me your time. So would you please go ahead and tell the listeners who you are, and maybe a little bit about yourself? And yeah.
Hi, my name is Andy Skinner, and I live in Southampton in the UK, in England. And my job, I have the best job in the world. I get to spend my time telling stories and learning about this incredible story of the RMS Titanic. And I do that in my capacity working at the museum in Southampton called SeaCity Museum. And I have been here for, I don't know, about 15 years. I came to study and then I've kind of stayed.
That's incredible. And I'm very interested in the Titanic, I will say, but I live in the United States, and I don't know a lot about British history and culture. But after reading Stephen Beale's book, which exclusively talks about the cultural relevance and history surrounding the Titanic, it just reminded me that having those contexts of culture really help you understand the base matter of the story you're trying to read.
Yeah, that whole kind of connection between different cultures, different nationalities, all thrown into the melting pot that was the Titanic is really fascinating. And I think that one of the reasons why people find it so interesting is that you see this sort of tiny little microcosm of society just before everything changes, and that happens in the First World War and beyond as well. And one thing international listeners need to know about Britain is we love our class system. We might not admit it to ourselves, but my goodness me, it is sort of written large into everything that happens, even today in modern times, but even more so in 1912.
I was about to say that America's class structure is a little bit more blurred. In that I think there's the impression here that you can really ascend your ranks and do stuff, and it's like, keep dreaming. But
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, put it this way: that the fact that most of the leaders of the UK, in terms of prime ministers, were all educated at one private school, that should teach you everything you need to know about British politics and class and culture and society.
So there's one place for the standard. Got it.
Yeah,
Uh,
one.
but yeesh, doesn't allow for a lot of viewpoints there.
No, not always. They crop up from time to time, but it is, it can be quite challenging.
It's fair. But what I mean, I'm sure that you could tell me. I do want to know a bit about what Southampton is like today. But before I ask about that, what was it like, or in the time of the Titanic, before the Titanic?
Mm.
Because that affected it quite a bit. But what was it like before? I in my head, I'm picturing a very bustling, busy sea city.
Yeah, there's definitely something of that. To kind of really understand Southampton's place in the time of the Titanic, you probably need to really start at the beginning of what we call the Victorian period. That's about
Hmm.
1838, because coinciding with the beginning of the reign of Queen Victoria,
Hmm.
pretty much is when they start building the docks here in Southampton. Before then, there were not established docks. Before then, there was no railway to speak of. But from about the 1830s, the late 1830s, is when you start getting a railway link from London, and it's when new um, large docks, which will allow for initially paddle steamers and sailing ships, and then as the 19th century progresses, you start beginning to see much larger ships, larger and larger and larger. And then into the beginning of the 20th century, you start having a lot more suburbs with um, men and women who are going to be working very closely in the docks and in the shipping trade. And then it's from 1907 that the White Star Line moves their transatlantic operations from Liverpool to Southampton. And with that, they create another new dock, which is where the Titanic leaves from. Population about 119,000 probably in 1912, and many of the people who were going to work on the Titanic live in Southampton. In fact, about 3/4 of all of the crew lived here, and that is one of the really main reasons why the story of the Titanic is so important for us here in Southampton. It's not
Mm-hmm.
that she left from here; it's that
Mm-hmm.
the men, mainly men, working on her, lived here.
Yeah. And that's especially why I wanted to talk to you, because my personal big interest in the Titanic and its story is these very human stories. The elements that, really tie it back to the men, the women, the children, the people that were on the ship. And um, I had spoken in the past to some people about, sort of Belfast and the Harland and Ship Wolf Yard. Nope, the Harland and Wolf Shipyard. But I can imagine that the impact on Southampton was swift and sorrowful.
Yeah, well, that you could definitely term it in those ways. I think I read somewhere, I couldn't quote you it off the top of my head, but that when the news starts getting back that the Titanic has sunk, and it's a bit like today, there's a lot of kind of misinformation that happens in the reporting of the Titanic. The first newspaper in the UK, the Daily Mirror, that reports it
Mhm.
kind of claims that everybody's okay. So
Yeah, I
you get a news.
remember hearing that, like, what a horrible roller coaster to ride.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing I remember reading is that sort of a hush descended on the town. Kind of, everything just almost they almost zone out, I suppose. And in those days too, if you were in mourning, you would show it in lots of ways, and whether it be the clothes that you wore, wearing black clothes to show you were mourning. Um,
You
it-
really only wore black clothes at the time to show you were in mourning, not so
yeah,
much today like it is. I'm wearing a black t-shirt right now.
yeah,
It wasn't a fashion color.
yeah. Oh well, absolutely. And because the White Star Line had an office in Southampton, a little bit like how if I don't know an aircraft came down, what tends to happen is the families of those people on the aircraft, they go to the airport, don't they, where the plane was either going to or flying from,
Right.
and the same thing kind of happens where they crowd around the offices of the White Star Line on a road called Canute Road, where all of the big shipping lines had offices. It was that kind of place. Opposite it was the tailor, where if you were a crew member, an officer, you might get your buttons and all those kind of things. It turns from being a hive of activity, lots of bustle as you talked about, to right. We're looking to see if the name of our loved one has been Morse coded across, so we can either begin mourning or looking forward to that day when they are returning back to Southampton.
How many came back?
Not enough. In terms of um, there were about 900 crew,
Right.
and I think somewhere in the region of 686 died in the crew.
Oh,
And like I said, most of them gave a
yeah.
Southampton address. That doesn't mean they were necessarily sort of born and bred in
Sure, sure,
Southampton.
sure, sure.
but they certainly, they had a presence here.
Yeah.
They may
Had
have been,
a life. I mean, maybe
yeah, they have
someone
a
did a
life.
sandwich order.
Yeah, absolutely. Might have been in one of the temperance hotels or um, there was a really large building called the Sailors' Home. I think there were about 27 people um, working on the Titanic who gave that as an address, and something
Wow.
like seven survived.
Oh,
So yes, these are huge numbers, and
yeah.
um, I sometimes reflect on that, the sheer human numbers cost of it all.
Hmm.
And here in the UK, we're no strangers to catastrophic events. The Blitz, for instance. Britain was pretty badly hit and bombed
Yeah.
in the Second World War. But in terms of mm, sort of a peacetime disaster
Hmm.
befalling one community, just in terms of like the numbers, which you can't always go on, but I
Hmm.
can't think of anywhere hit in one fell swoop like Southampton was after the sinking of the Titanic. That is how horrific it was. It was said that everybody knew somebody who'd been on the Titanic. Every street was affected by the sinking. I think that's true as well, pretty
Hmm.
much, and
I
without
think
much embellishment.
I think it was Stephen Beale who told me that I couldn't find it, but there was a graphic that was sort of an aerial map of Southampton that indicated every home that had lost someone, and there was places where you couldn't make it down the block.
Yeah, yeah. If your listeners want to kind of look at that, there's a great website called Historic Southampton, and the chap behind it called Russell Masters has put together a brilliant interactive map where you can literally go on the addresses and you can go into the sailors' home. It will tell you all the people that were there and
Wow.
what happened to them, if they survived or not.
What's
Um,
that site again?
a historic Southampton.
Historic Southampton. All one word?
Yeah, I think .com, maybe .co.uk. We'll put it in the we'll put a link.
Yeah, this sounds fascinating. But yeah, I'm sure that it was obviously very emotionally impactful, but I'm also sure that in the long term, that was quite an economic impact to the city to lose a large portion of its labor force.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And added to that, if you'd opened your newspapers before the Titanic, you wouldn't have been reading about this great big ocean liner that was sailing from Southampton. You'd
Right.
have been reading about the fact that in the UK, generally, there was a miners' strike for coal, and this effectively left Southampton in real trouble because no trains really can run without coal. Obviously, the ocean liners are dependent on coal as well, and your homes. So unemployment was, I think, around 17,000 beforehand, and then of course afterwards, a huge proportion of the population are going to have been affected in some way. And this is the days before the welfare state. So there's no kind of easy payout. So they create what was known as the Titanic Relief Fund, and there was a lady who was appointed. She was the lady visitor. So if you were a widow or a dependent of somebody who died, she would come round and I suppose offer support, financial support as much as anything. Things happened like children could sometimes be offered an afforded education that they might not necessarily have had before. That sometimes happened too. So yeah, it was very, very difficult indeed.
I can only imagine, especially at a time when like many women couldn't or weren't able to work. Your husband's gone, or maybe you've lost your husband and two of your sons. How do you take care of the remaining kids? Or even if it's just you, what do you do about you?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes the pragmatic approach was to remarry. That happened reasonably
Sure.
often for pragmatic reasons as much as love. Um,
I do love not being homeless, so I see that.
yeah, I mean, having a roof over your head, it's not a
Hmm.
bad thing.
No,
as,
no.
as life goes. Yeah, really, yeah, very, very difficult indeed. But I think it was a harder time generally. And
Right.
That generation and the ones before and after were incredibly resilient, so they found a way to get around it. Um, there was also effectively the workhouse. If you needed to, you could have an offer of the house and go into the Southampton workhouse, and they would provide bed and board, but it was pretty miserable. Um,
Sure.
yeah, you wouldn't really want to do that if you could possibly avoid it. But there were ways, and in those days before the war, particularly, a lot of women would go into service. So they would go and maybe be cleaners or whatever it might be in a home, be
Right.
servants. But remember, it's only going to be 2 years until the Great War is going to break
Yeah.
out. And in World War One, far more people were killed than on the Titanic, and that's going to really change. That's going to like throw up everything in society, and
Yeah.
you're going to see how it lands when the war finishes in 1918. So having that
What did
kind of
happen?
what did well for a start. Occupations that traditionally had been closed to women opened up. So, for instance,
Right.
in Southampton, they could become tram conductresses, which before they couldn't have done. They could work in factories. That was really
Yeah.
key.
It happened in the
Um,
United States too.
yeah, because the men are at
Mm-hmm.
war and they need to do something. Um, and then when the war ends, the mantra was that they would create a home fit for heroes, those returning soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
So there is wage inflation, and the men are returning, and they're not going to become servants again like they were before. They want different jobs and better paid jobs, and crucially. So things are going to massively change, and this is again going back to that Titanic
Mm-hmm.
um, sort of the way that you get this snapshot just before everything changes. In 15 years after the Titanic, you wouldn't have had that same class system represented
Right.
in quite the same way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've said it a few times on the show where we've had class structure in the United States, but it's definitely not been as I, I don't know what the word I'm looking for, intricate as Britain has been over the years. And we never had them.
It's not
Yeah,
set in stone, is it?
no, it's never been an official monarchy. There's the class difference I would say would be people who are like extremely high-ranking politicians and therefore untouchable, and then the extremely wealthy and celebrities who, because of that reason, are also untouchable. But it's really different because the last class barriers I can really think of were beforehand when women had fewer rights, and then slavery,
Yeah.
our proudest moment.
Well, every society has got its demons and its dark moments, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's just quite interesting how these things play out, and some things are good and some things aren't so good, but yeah, certainly when reflecting on the Titanic, it's really interesting seeing that kind of comparison from then to just a few years afterwards.
Yeah. Because I imagine too that again, even if we just skip to the end of the war, where not even the end of it, we're like 5 years past when people have quote unquote settled down. I'm sure the society between 1912 and 1925 are basically unrecognizable to each other.
Yeah, I think so, and I think it's partly because of the changing system of the US immigration system as well. I can't remember exactly when they start putting quotas on the number of people that can come into the country, but it would be around that kind of time. Um,
I'm not sure
so
either.
so shipping lines, the White Star Lines and the Cunards and the like, have to start thinking about, oh, hang on a second, it's not going to be just a case of having third class steerage. You now need to make it tourist class, so that because it's not just about getting people through into New York or wherever. It's a case of, oh, you can make it a holiday and so on. So yeah, I mean, there's so many kind of aspects that all play into Southampton, of course, because if the immigration system is changing, well then the people coming through Southampton is going to change as well.
Because beforehand, a lot of people would use Southampton as their departure point for moving to America. That was one of the ways you would make it.
Yeah, that's right. there's a building. It still stands today. Again, very close to where Southampton departs. It was called the Atlantic Hotel, or the Immigrants Hotel, and it was a huge, quite a really big, 350 room thing, and it was primarily for Eastern Europeans who would come in before going on an ocean liner, and by all accounts, it was pretty miserable. People would basically sleep on a concrete floor. There were disinfecting kind of rooms because of the concern about sickness, and basically the ocean liner companies didn't want to have to bring the third class back again if they didn't pass the immigration checks in America. So yeah, so it's disinfecting rooms. It's really horrible. It's probably quite a reasonably ropey area of town as well. Although it's a dry hotel, i.e., you're not allowed to drink alcohol. It's in a row of I think there are about 6 pubs in a row or something. So you kind of get a gist of the type of place that it is. And interestingly, in fact, 2 of the passengers are linked to that hotel, and they're not Eastern Europeans. There was a lady called Ada Doling. She was a second class passenger. Her husband managed this hotel, and about 9 months, I think 9 months and 13 days after the sinking, she gave birth. So that might have been the youngest person on the Titanic, in a sense. I think it was a girl.
Oh,
But
wow.
yeah, so it kind of, yeah, you've got some nice, interesting links between the Titanic at the end and the Atlantic Hotel, that area of the town.
I imagine there's a lot of links between the Titanic and a bunch of places in Southampton for any numerous reasons, either because somebody lived there at that place or if it was I don't know, a favorite restaurant.
Yeah, well, absolutely. The there was a there was a train station in the docks. It's a casino today, and if you were first or well, any class really, you can go on the special boat train, the sort of Titanic train, and if you're third class, it gets you in much earlier than first class. They can pretty much just swan on to the Titanic.
Hmm,
But next to it, to this station, was a large hotel, and this is a very fancy hotel, and actually that is where Thomas Andrews spends a pretty much a week, because Titanic was in Southampton for about a week or so, and
for
he
like the
and
finishing touches or
yeah, well, exactly. So
ah,
everyone knows Thomas Andrews was very assiduous. He was, he cared deeply about his work, and he would stay in the hotel, and then about 8:30 in the morning, he would pop over to the Titanic and try and work out if the fans were working, because there was problems with some of the second class areas, the heating wasn't working, and so on. And I've got one book that suggests that the the grand staircase clock, well, it hadn't been fitted. So on
hmm,
the journey round from Belfast to Southampton, they had a mirror there instead. So that's added in
fun.
Southampton. So you imagine Thomas Andrews, just making sure that it's in the right place, and they're the kind of final checks that he's doing. But as well as that, Captain Smith breakfasts there, and the day before the sailing, on the 9th, who should come down in the again chauffeur-driven car? Well, it's Bruce Ismay. So he spends his last night before sailing at this very magnificent hotel. Again, it still stands today. In the Second World War, it was rumored to have been one of the places where Winston Churchill and I think Eisenhower um, planned D-Day, because Southampton was a major embarkation point for D-Day in 1944. So, there's a lot of history and a lot of stories linked to the Titanic here in Southampton.
What's one of the most interesting stories that you don't think most people know about?
Well, I don't know what most people don't know about the Titanic. A really interesting, really kind of fun one. It's kind of well known in Southampton, but maybe not quite so much further afield. Is about three men who were signed up to be firemen, stokers, shoveling coal. Um, these are brothers, and on the day of the sailing, what happened was the crew would go onto would effectively muster on the Titanic, kind of sign to say they're going to be back at the time of the sailing, which is 12 o'clock, and then they go back into the town where there were loads of pubs. And there's a pub in Southampton called the Grapes,
I've
and
heard of the grapes.
there's a big picture of the Titanic on the outside of it for this reason, for this story. So they're in this pub with a few other friends as well, who kind of, they there's quite a big drinking culture because the Titanic was dry, according to the White Star Line regs. If you're a crew member, you're not meant to be drinking. So
Oh,
I'm
that's a
sure,
bummer.
yeah. So I'm sure they made up for it when they're in port. So even though it's 8 o'clock in the morning, they're still very happy
I
to go to
have
the pubs.
I have to say that was one thing I never understood in the Cameron film. It was like that is 10:30 in the morning and they're having a poker game with beer. But you said that, you know what? That makes sense if they were like, damn, we gotta load up before we
Yeah.
get on this
Yeah,
boat.
well, yeah, I don't know about the third class. I mean, the third class probably were allowed to drink, but the crew certainly weren't meant to. Anyway, so they're drinking, and then at about 10 to 12, by all accounts, these brothers and then a couple of mates realise, oh, crikey, we're close now. So they leave this pub, and it's not, as the crow flies, it's not far from where the Titanic departs from, but it, it's far enough away because in those days there were, I think, about 6 railways that intersected the route effectively which they would need to make, and there was probably a tank engine that was passing through. Now their mates who they were with were able to get ahead of this train, but the Slade brothers were not, and they had to
Ugh,
wait. And then by the time the train's gone, and by the time they get to the Titanic, the doors um, have closed, and there are eyewitnesses from the Titanic kind of saying, "Oh, we saw these people with all their kit trying to get to the Titanic, and they weren't allowed."
right.
So they're it's an example of drinking being good for you because it obviously saved their lives. But
Right.
their view on all this was, oh well, we'd have been all right if we'd been on the Titanic, we'd have been okay. And I think the reason that there was this view was that the two friends they were with both survived,
Huh.
William Nutbean and John Podesta. So, there's that sense of, oh, we'd have been okay.
We'd have been with
Um,
our lucky friends.
yeah, and the other kind of big Southampton event that takes place is around the time of the sailing, which is the near collision with the American line ship New York,
Yeah.
which happens just as Titanic is leaving, and New York has had all of its coal taken off because of this coal strike that we talked about earlier,
Right.
and um, the American line and White Star Line were both owned by effectively the same company, International Mercantile Marine. So they obviously want to prioritize the Titanic. So a number of passengers have their tickets switched to the Titanic. The coal is taken onto the Titanic from New York.
Hmm.
And as Titanic departs, I think because of the sheer size of her, it pulls the New York away from its mooring lines, which snap, and they come to they come about 4 foot, 1 meter 20 from
Oof.
colliding, and it's only the quick thinking of the tugs that stops them from sinking. And
Oof.
a weird, I believe that the story of the Titanic is full of all sorts of coincidences, but one kind of interesting thing was I was at one of our museums some years ago now,
Hmm.
and I started talking to a visitor, and we started talking about the Titanic, and she said to me that her father had been involved in the tugs on that day.
Ooh.
Yeah, and she said that he always blamed himself for
Hmm.
the sinking of the Titanic.
Oi.
For the that kind of reason of if he hadn't done his job as well as he did, then maybe they'd have collided, and if they'd collided, then the Titanic might have been damaged or been delayed or
Oh.
whatever, and then it's like the butterfly effect. One little thing can change
Sure.
change all of history, and it was so sad, really, because this man, he lived his life kind of with this sense, and he's obviously not his fault at all, but it didn't
No.
stop him living with it. So
Yeah.
for us here in Southampton, we all the time we meet people with these connections to the Titanic, I work a lot with school children, and at least once a week there'll be a school child that comes, and they'll be related to somebody who was on board the Titanic. We've had people related to Bruce Ismay, um, to well, to pretty much everybody. Harold Lowe, we had someone from related to Harold Lowe, and
That's
um,
incredible.
yeah, and it's all all the time. It's almost like the people that aren't related to the Titanic are in the minority, and the people that are.
That would be
It's
me.
astonishing. I'm being a bit facetious, really. There are a lot who aren't, but it is, very interesting.
It is it's a very wide net, especially as we get further and further away, and people spread out more. There's definitely more of those connections, and especially with things like 23andMe coming out, the ability to just find your history is
Yeah,
really in your hands.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, it's the idea we're all of us related to. Who was it? Genghis Khan, isn't it? We're all related to Genghis Khan, I
I
believe.
think so.
Go back far enough, you're all going to be related.
Basically, it's that whole 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, except in like a practical sense. But
Yeah, no, definitely.
is Southampton a really blended community just because it was a little bit more transitory of a city, or not so much?
It's a really diverse city.
Hmm.
In terms of, I mean, Southampton's today is twice as large as it was in 1912, more than twice as large.
Oh, wow.
I think in the census last year, I think it's about 250,000 today.
Oh, yeah.
Um, Huge numbers of all sorts of people from different nations across the earth, which makes it yeah such a really strong community. Um, which you wouldn't have seen in 1912. I mean, it's particular, and this is true across the United Kingdom. Kind of post Second World War is when you see um, kind of great melting pots of people. But um, even in sort of Tudor periods, you're getting people of colour living in Southampton. You get a lot of um, kind of Lashkars and coming in, working in Southampton, sailors from all kinds of places in the world. You've probably heard of The Six, the movie about the eight Chinese passengers, six of whom survived. Well,
Yeah, I haven't had a chance
um,
to see it yet, but I have heard of it.
yeah, you'll love it. It's great, and of course, where do they get on? They get on in Southampton, and
Of
you know
course.
they're accepted for who they are. So it's yeah, it was a really kind of vibrant community.
Even in 1912, when diversity wasn't as much of a thing, was Southampton maybe more diverse than more other places in Britain, simply because it was, this major hub, an
I think
international hub?
Yeah, I think maritime centres, Liverpool, London, Southampton, Glasgow. You'd have, you would they would have been a lot more diverse than even close by cities and towns like Winchester and places like that. So yeah, you wouldn't have been surprised by the people that you saw in Southampton. And we've talked already about huge numbers of Eastern Europeans, so there'd have been loads of different languages spoken. And
Right.
as you say, kind of passing through. I mean, Southampton has a nickname in the days of Empire. It was known as Gateway to the Empire. Um, and at one stage, a third of the world or something was painted red in the British Empire for good or ill. Today, it's more known as Southampton Gateway to the World, and
Hmm.
the same idea applies. Yeah, so certainly there would have been huge, different kind of communities in the town at that stage.
It makes sense to me. Just by nature of
Yeah,
being an international gateway, you're going to have a lot of different people coming through. It's just the nature of things.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for instance, on the Titanic, I think a lot of people from say a lot is made about the Lebanese, for instance. I think they probably would have got on in I haven't checked it, but they've probably got one in Cherbourg, I would imagine. Whereas in Britain, in Southampton, you're probably looking at um, more sort of English passengers,
Hmm.
and then a lot of Irish getting on in Queenstown, what's now Cove,
Right.
just because of the geography of it, really.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Well, that makes
but I would
sense.
need you need to check that.
I have no idea. I'm terrible. I don't even know the geography of the state that I live in, let alone other countries. I'm horrible with them. But
Well, here in Southampton, we're at the very bottom of South. If you get a map of Britain, you go right down to the bottom in the middle. That's Southampton.
well, I would like to visit one day, so that's very good to know. But I just realized the first question I ask everyone is normally, "What is your Titanic story?" I haven't asked you that yet. What is your Titanic story? I mean, you
Mm.
you grew up in Southampton, I think, but everyone has their own personal story.
I didn't grow up in
No,
Southampton,
you didn't. I'm sorry.
actually. Yeah,
You said you lived there for the past 15-ish years.
yeah. So my Titanic story began. I'm kind of at a funny age. I was not quite old enough for the movie in '97.
How old were you?
Well, I think I was 11. It was a
Oh, I was
12 in the
8,
UK, so I was, it's that like little thing.
but my mom took
So
me to see it anyway.
really, well, my
Yes.
mum didn't let me. So when I turned 12, I with my birthday money, I went to the video shop and I bought the movie,
Oh.
and it got me interested at that stage. And
Hmm.
then I kind of grew up and didn't really think too much about it. And then when I came to Southampton, um, I read history at the university here and kind of got
Hmm.
interested in it. Um, and then when I was thinking about kind of museums work, the SeaCity Museum, which is the Titanic Museum here in Southampton,
Hmm.
opened, and so I was able to kind of get a job here. But one of the weird
Incredible.
things I talked about strange coincidences is my wife Jo um, had was related to the youngest person on the Titanic and the last survivor, Milvina Dean.
That's right. She passed away not too long ago, right?
Well, 2009, but that's still
Oh my god.
relatively.
I thought it was like 3 years ago. Time is a
No,
soup. I'm so sorry.
Milvina Dean passed away
Melvina
on
Dean.
the anniversary of Titanic's launch,
April
31st of
10th.
May.
Oh, 31st of May.
Which is a funny old, yes, it's a funny old kind of world that we live on, in that Joe's related to this incredibly kind of important
Hmm.
passenger, and now I spend my days telling the stories of Titanic. So it's strange coincidences abound in the story of the Titanic.
That's amazing. That sounds like a dream job.
It's the best job in the world.
Yeah, I'm jealous. Sounds like it's a lot of fun.
So,
What is your
yeah.
what is the day in the life of working at the Titanic Museum in Southampton?
Oh, well, it depends. But a lot of it is for the next generation, really. So we spend a lot of time
Hmm.
working with school groups that are local to Southampton and further afield as well.
Hmm.
Today, I was taking some group of people around one of our magnificent buildings, and we went into one of them, and there's a book of honour for those who were lost on the Titanic, and a little
Hmm.
plaque about the postal workers, all of whom were lost as well. So even on a day that isn't specifically about the Titanic, there's always Titanic in there somewhere.
Yeah, I mean it's like the primary thread in the Southampton tapestry for some.
Well, it is in the first sort of half of the 20th century, and now we're still living with the consequences of it. It casts a shadow over the town,
Hmm.
and it's so important, I think, not to forget it.
Yeah.
History is there to remind us so we don't make similar mistakes again, really, and to learn from those mistakes too. So if I can do my bit in some small way in reminding people about this incredibly relevant story, then I'll be happy.
I think that too, it helps that there has been a consistent sort of current of Titanic mania in the past 20-25 years. There's always new content, new books, new TV shows, new documentaries. There's always new content being produced.
Yeah, because for the first, well, in the aftermath of the sinking, it was one
Hmm.
of those things, a bit like people's experiences in wartime. They really didn't want to talk about it, and
Right.
that was absolutely true in Southampton as well. People that whose fathers or probably mud had fathers who were lost on it.
Yeah.
Their parents wouldn't talk about it. I mentioned Milvina Dean. She didn't see
Hmm.
a picture of her father who died until she was an adult, when a family member showed it to her. And if
Wow.
that doesn't tell you kind of how people responded initially, I don't know what will. And I think it was around the time of Walter Lord's book and then the film, A Night to Remember, which I think is late 50s. That's kind of when interest begins. But as you know, it's not really until 97 that's when things really kind of kick off in quite a major way. And
Yeah.
um, it's obviously a major it's a major talking point. Lots of documentaries and weird conspiracy theories about all sorts of weird things. They kind of keep it in the public domain. And here in the UK, there's an auction house that probably every year they auction off something from the Titanic that's of interest. I think there
Yeah.
were people that sold Wallace Hartley's violin for about over
Yeah,
a
I think
million
so.
pounds, I think. Um,
Oof.
so that keeps it in the newspapers.
I think I saw like a YouTube video or something about that auction house a while ago, and they were interviewing a lady who, like, I don't know, she specifically collects menu cards. That's her
Okay.
thing. She likes the menus.
Yeah. We've got some lovely menus at our museum.
Oh,
We've got
sure.
one from the 11th of April, which is a breakfast menu from the first class. We think we've got
Mm.
second class menu as well. But they were also they were postcards,
Hmm.
which is kind of cool. So people would send them off, which is why some of them have survived.
Yeah.
So they were sent, I think, in Ireland. They went on the in the mail sacks and survived the sinking.
What's your favorite thing in the museum?
I have many. The one
I'm
I
sure.
the one I really like are what it is a bracelet, and on the
Hmm.
bracelet are three hazelnuts, and the hazelnuts were in the pocket
Hmm.
of a second class saloon steward called Walter Nichols.
Hmm.
So he has them while the Titanic is sinking, and I suspect they didn't really get proper breaks, which explains why he had them. And he obviously kept them in the aftermath,
Yeah.
um, and he gave them to his wife, who then I'm not sure if she got it made into a bracelet or not, but it's kind of one little object that tells a story, and
Yeah.
it's an amazing little thing. So that's one of my faves.
It's really neat. I have to plan a trip somehow to Southampton. I want to see the city.
Yeah, obviously you would love it. Anybody who gets the chance, thoroughly recommend it. If you can, take yourself to the museums, but also just walk around. You can,
Hmm.
get a map, take yourself around all the kind of sites associated with the Titanic, and you can breathe in that sea air and get a sense of what it might have been like back in 1912, 110 years ago.
What's the best place for someone to stay? Like, I'm from the United States, and I'm sure that, you could find a Hyatt or whatever, but like, where would you recommend if someone wanted to actually be kind of near enough to go see a few
Oh,
places, maybe?
I don't. There's a umpteen different hotels that you
I'm
can stay
sure.
in. It's a shame that the Southwestern Hotel, which is the big one that Captain Smith had breakfast in and so on. Unfortunately, that used to be a hotel, but it's not anymore. Um,
Oh.
but yeah, but that's an amazing building. It's one of these ones. Every so often, you hear places where they go, the grand staircase is designed after this building, and they say that about the Southwestern House. Now, I'm not saying it was, but it does
Hmm.
have quite a nice staircase, which has similarities to the grand staircase on the
I mean, the
on the
millionaire's
Titanic.
captain had breakfast there. I'm sure the staircase was quite nice.
Yes, it was, and it also has kind of I think they're 1930s lifts, but they're quite
Ooh.
similar to the ones they might have had on the Titanic. The kind of one you need a concierge to take you up.
Yeah.
It's that kind of place.
I want to operate one. Not for very long. I just want to be able to say I've done it.
Push the button. Yeah.
Yeah, basically. I'm a child.
Not we all.
I think so. But I don't know. I think maybe there is a bit of childlike fascination that is involved with liking the Titanic so much.
Well, I'll tell you what, the response we get from, 7-year-olds in local to us here in Southampton, a lot of sort of 7-year-olds study the Titanic, and
Makes
you
sense.
they just run with it. They're like sponges, and they're so fascinated by it. They'll be filled with facts. They'll tell you with glee that the fourth funnel was fake, and everything else. And it's that is really quite encouraging that story is safe for
Yeah.
another generation and hopefully far beyond that as well.
I was a friend of mine messaged me a little while ago and she was like, I thought you'd be interested to know that my daughter is really interested in the Titanic. I was very interested to know that. And of course, I was like, oh my gosh, if she ever wants to watch the movie, let me know. Cause I'm like, I don't know what else I could show her.
Yeah.
And we recently did watch the movie with her. But yeah, I think she's 11 now or something. But still, there is a fascination there. And I follow the Titanic subreddit on Reddit, and every so often someone posts a picture their kid drew or like
Mm.
a picture of their 5-year-old coloring in the Titanic, and it's very interesting to me because kids get hooked on the funniest things. I think there was a viral post years ago about like a 5-year-old who had a birthday party themed after a local realtor because he was just like obsessed with the guy, and it's like that's kind of that's very funny. But kids, as you said, they're like sponges, and I don't know, especially for kids in Southampton being such a deep part of their history, it makes a lot of sense that they'd be wanting to dive in, pun
Yeah,
partially intended.
I think so. And also, at its basic, everybody can understand the Titanic story because it's about a ship that
Sure.
sank after hitting an iceberg. But
Right.
then you can start peeling back the layers and you can get a whole lot more out of it. And I've been working at SeaCity Museum for over 10 years, and I'm still learning brand new things every day. So it's a huge mine of things to discover that can last a lifetime and probably many lifetimes,
Right.
which is why it can be such a it's so self-contained, isn't it? As a subject, you can you can keep it on the ship,
Mm-hmm.
so it doesn't get away from you in quite the same way that other subjects can.
Sure.
Tangents you because you're always drawn back to that ship, that 269 meters of iron and steel and wood and the rest of it. Um, yeah, which I think helps quite a lot when you're trying to kind of consolidate why it's an interesting story.
I think it also helps that it's in the past, so it's not an ongoing event we're studying. Anything that can have happened to the ship has happened. Well, unless you're studying the degradation, but in terms of the wreck and the sinking, it's like it happened already. There's
Yeah,
we're not tracking the disaster. This is something that is a completed event in the past.
yes, I think that does help, and maybe with the particularly like the aspect of loss, the
Yeah.
human cost.
Yes.
We wouldn't be able to have the conversations that we're having in 1922 because it would remain so raw still. Um,
I agree.
I think the idea of people discussing I don't know, like the fuel consumption of the RMS Titanic, or um, the big ones about fire on board and all those things.
Right.
That they would have just been totally insensitive to be having those sorts of discussions
Right.
in soon afterwards. But enough time has passed. Nobody who is on the Titanic is still alive, and in fact, most of their children have now passed away. Um,
Yeah.
it becomes a more kind of palatable story to look into. I think. Um,
It does. You
yeah,
have some distance from it.
yeah,
The example that I use all the time is 9/11. We're not far enough away from that yet to have the to we I couldn't have 9/11 talk line.
no,
We're not there. We haven't learned the lessons we've needed to learn yet. We haven't gotten over that first hurdle of not accepting that loss, but just getting over that first wave of like that next generation hasn't quite come to pass yet. Excuse me, but I'm sure in 70 or so years will be the narrative, not the narrative, but like maybe the vibe around it will be different. Maybe it will be because we have found that distance.
Mm.
I don't know.
I
I'm
think you can.
speculating.
No, I think you're right. I think you can also follow the general narrative of history much more clearly now, can't you? You know, it's
Mm-hmm.
effectively hindsight, which you can't do with the 9/11
Yeah.
yet, really, because you know, we're still working through the permutations of what happened
Yep.
then. Whereas for the Titanic, enough time has passed so that it has kind of um, yeah, kind of expanded outwards, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I know, like, there was a movie made right after the Titanic went down. The copies didn't survive, but and then similarly, I think Oliver Stone made a 9/11 movie. I didn't watch it, but I think it'll be a while before someone tries to make a Hollywood epic about the Twin Towers. We're not in that time frame where people would be receptive to that yet.
There've been a few, haven't there? 9/11 movies because there was the one with Nicolas Cage playing a firefighter. Is that the Oliver Stone one?
Oh, I
Oliver,
don't know.
yeah, Nicolas Cage played a firefighter, and then there was also United. Is it United '93, which is about the plane that was hijacked. Um,
You're right. World Trade Center, the film was.
is that what it was? Did it have Nick Cage in it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, I saw it at the cinema. I think
Oh my
it
gosh,
wasn't
I didn't even
great.
know that existed.
Wasn't great. Yeah, I mean, yeah, the movies on Titanic. You know, they like you say, Dorothy Gibson starring in it.
That's the one.
Having been having been on the Titanic, that's a weird thing. I wish they did survive, but
I find it fascinating that she wore the same dress and not
mm,
a. And I think in today's day and age, someone would be like, "I think that might not be a good idea.
yeah,
I think she should see a grief counselor first." But back then, they're like, "Yeah, get her on the set.
yeah,
You're
come on, make
fine.
it. We'll make money. Yeah, it's a
You got it,
funny
don't
old
you,
world.
sweetheart?"
Yeah, weird, isn't
Yeah.
it? Um, the fact they made it in 1912 is really quite bizarre. There've been all sorts of movies. There was a German propaganda movie, wasn't there, as well? Which
I
kind of
haven't seen it yet, but
well, I haven't seen it. I know they made one.
yeah, I
Um,
think it's basically. I don't. I get the impression that it's. I think they raised the Titanic, the Germans do, or something.
well, there
I
is
have
a movie. There's Raise the Titanic.
yes, but I
That was
think this
the
is.
oh right. I don't know. Maybe.
I have
Um,
no idea. I'm frantically googling.
yeah. I think it's 40, maybe 43 or something. They basically
Yep.
blame the Brits and the Americans kind of come across very badly, and
Yes, it
yeah.
was. Let's say here. Uh, it was commissioned by Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels with the intent of showing not only the superiority of German filmmaking, but also as a propaganda vehicle, which would depict British and American capitalism as being responsible for the disaster. Which I mean, maybe it was.
Mm, yeah, that's a whole nother question, isn't it? Um, yeah, the extent to which people were cutting corners or not, or is
Okay,
again,
I'm
like we
mixing up
said,
movies in my head.
there are so many avenues that one can go down. Um,
Yes.
only some of them suitable for 7-year-olds.
Yeah, that was going to be my other question. What do you recommend for kids? Because I saw Titanic when I was 8. My mother allowed me. I'm not mad about it, but I know that not everyone's parents were quite so generous, and I will say that I think that is sort of the current quintessential Titanic film,
Mm.
the most recent
Uh,
one. What about A Night to Remember? Would you recommend that for kids, or is that still
I
a
don't
little
know. My
much?
daughter is 7. She studied the Titanic now,
Hmm.
and it was amazing. Got to give her a tour. It was amazing, and
That's
they came with their
awesome.
school trip.
Best
Um,
best daddy
I
daughter school project.
oh, I know. Tell me about it. It was amazing. I haven't shown her the '97 film, and I won't
Sure.
yet, for all sorts of reasons.
I mean that's a lot for a 7-year-old. Even rating aside, like just watching the sinking is it's very
Well, yeah,
intense.
she'd have to watch someone pinging off a propeller.
Sorry.
She doesn't even know where babies come from either, so that'd be a whole other question.
Yeah, I didn't know what suicide was when I saw the movie, so that was an
Hmm.
absolutely baffling moment for me.
So I don't know. Night's Room might be not be a bad one. It's as I'm sure you know, it's meant to be one of the more accurate in terms of
Mm-hmm.
an account. The
Right.
black and white thing might be a bit tricky for a 7-year-old to get over. Just
Yeah.
whatever the merits of it might be.
Yeah.
We watched a thing about the I think it was one of the James Cameron like documentaries. We
Oh
watched
yeah,
it
I think
together.
the Ghosts of the Abyss is whatever he called it or
Yeah,
something.
I think it was that. We watched that together. It was quite interesting. But yeah, it's a hard one. There isn't really a really kind of child friendly movie about the Titanic. There's some really good books though.
Yes.
Michael Morpurgo, who's a British author, wrote a book called Casper, Prince of Cats, and that kind of it's about a cat um, and other things, but there are lots of events that happen in it, including the Titanic. So it's sort of
Uh-huh.
incidental. So that's a really nice sort of way in
That's so
for
cute.
younger children. He's an
I also
excellent author. He's one of the best.
I don't remember the name because that would be useful, but I remember reading a book when I think maybe I was 10 or so about excuse me, a young boy, a fictional boy. I think he was a second class passenger. I remember really liking that.
Mm.
I'm gonna
Yeah,
have to figure out the name now.
yeah. I'm not familiar with that one, but yeah, fictionalized, books are great. Books are fantastic.
I know that the Magic Tree House series had a Titanic one,
Okay. I think
and
young Indiana Jones had a Titanic one too.
I
If you
believe that.
I
I've also
speak
recently
that
found
out.
out about author Lindsay Littleton, who wrote a book called Titanic Detective Agency, which I think is also a children's Titanic book.
Well, there you go. Well, maybe the time is right for a new, um, rendering on film for something for younger kids
I don't
that
even know how
maybe
you would
doesn't
do that.
mention death.
I was about to say, how would you do that?
Yes, we do occasionally. We have had in the past schools contact us and say, "We're learning about the Titanic, but we'd
Mhm.
rather you didn't mention death," which is, it's not very easy.
I was gonna
You're
say,
talking
what an
about,
ask.
you know, one of the take-home messages is 1,500 people lost their lives when the Titanic sank. And actually, weirdly, kids really, I
Hmm.
wouldn't say they really like talking about death, but they are actually okay looking at it. And in
Hmm.
some ways, the Titanic isn't a bad one to use as their because of, as we talked about, lots of times past. So
Hmm.
in some ways, um, it's not a bad one. And what we find actually is kids that they can actually be maybe a little bit too excited about it, and we have to temper them down rather than being distraught about what happened. And that's a lesson in empathy and respect. Again, important for us, things for us to be talking about.
I've noticed that little kids like to talk about big things.
Yeah, and why shouldn't they?
Mhm.
It's part of the human condition, after all.
Yeah, I think that I wouldn't be very good to talk to kids because I just tend to answer questions exactly as they come. But I mean, I always found that interesting that, if you do have to have a conversation with a child about something like loss or whatever, they usually take it better than you think that they will.
Yeah, they kids are amazing, really. That's why I'm very hopeful about the future, because yeah, they surpass our expectations most of the time, despite
Most
the
of the
fact
time.
most
Other
of the time.
times, other times they come to you and don't want to tell you that there's a Lego up their nose.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. That's bad enough too.
It's a balancing act. It's a balancing act, learning about death and how not to put your dinner up your nose.
That's right.
I'm never having children. Well, Andy, thank you so much for letting me waste your night. I'm sorry that it was so late.
No, it's been fun. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on. I want to thank Andy again so much for coming on the show, and he really encourages you to check out the interactive map of the Titanic crew. You can find that at historic Southampton, that's all one word, .co.uk/crew. And I think that's a really, really fun, not exactly fun, but it's a really interesting resource. And also, if you're in the UK or you're thinking about going to Southampton, I encourage you to check out his museum, the SeaCity Museum. And you can see that online at SeaCityMuseum, all one word, .co.uk. And if you want to get in touch with Andy himself, he is on Twitter at Andy V as in victory, Skinner, ANDYVSKINNE. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can get in touch with me on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at Titanic Talkline. That's my username on all three. Or you can email me at titanictalkline@gmail.com, and I will get back to you. And I will also see you next time. Bye.